This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to use the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription.
As you've probably noticed, both China and India have been conspicuously restrained in their criticism of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In accordance with their long-standing policy of neutrality, India has refused to criticise the war and has instead started buying Russian oil on the cheap, while China has parroted Russia's narrative about NATO expansion and criticising the US for stoking tension in the region. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Russia-India-China strategic triangle, the current state of relations between the trio, and how the relationship might evolve. So let's start with the current state of relations. Broadly, while Russia has relatively good relations with the other two, China and India don't really get on. When it comes to Indo-Russian relations, the two have basically been friends since India and the Soviet Union signed the Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in 1971. This was India's first bilateral treaty and acted as a counterbalance to the emerging Pakistan-US-China alliance. Even when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia and India maintained strong relations, and in 2000 Putin and then Prime Minister Atal Bihari signed another treaty, the Strategic Partnership, which was renamed the Special and Privileged Strategic Partnership in 2010. Russia has also stated that it supports India receiving a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and is one of the few countries that supports India's claim over Kashmir. The foundation of this partnership has been military hardware. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of India's arms imports comes from Russia, making it Russia's biggest arms market, and most of India's military hardware today is basically old Soviet or Russian stock. While they don't do that much commercial trade with one another, both countries apparently want this to change. In 2015, Putin and Modi set a target of $30 billion in bilateral trade by 2025, up from $10 billion today. These warm relations, combined with India's long-standing policy of neutrality, helped explain why India has been so reluctant to criticise Russia's invasion of Ukraine or join in with Western-led sanctions. When it comes to Sino-Russian relations, while the two weren't friends back in the days of the Soviet Union, relations have rapidly improved in the 30 years since. China and the Soviet Union really didn't get on. The two sides actually fought a brief border war in 1969, and China supported the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets during their invasion. Nonetheless, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, relations have rapidly improved. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighbourliness and Friendly Cooperation, which includes something that sounds a lot like a mutual defence clause in Article 9, and was renewed in 2021. Sino-Russian relations are motivated by a mutual distrust of the West and good personal relations between Xi and Putin. As with India, there's also a military element. China used to buy a lot of military hardware from Russia, although exports have declined from their peak in the early 2000s as China has developed its own domestic industry. But while India and China are pretty friendly with Russia, they're not so keen on one another. Despite strong trading relations, China is India's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade totaling $95 billion last year, Sino-Indian relations have been strained by an ongoing border dispute. China and India disagree over the territorial status of Aksai Chin, an area administered by China as part of Xinjiang, and Arunachal Pradesh, an area administered by India. The two sides have fought 3 wars over the territories: the Sino-Indian War of 1962, the border clashes in 1967, and the 1987 standoff. In the summer of 2020, there were further skirmishes around the Galwan Valley, resulting in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an unconfirmed number of Chinese soldiers. India also doesn't like China's close relationship with Pakistan, and while the two countries do a lot of trade, there's an uncomfortable trade imbalance. India's trade deficit with China hit about $70 billion last year, which means that most bilateral trade involved India importing Chinese goods, which doesn't sit well with Indian economic nationalists and has provoked concern in India about an over-reliance on Chinese goods. So that's the current state of relations. Now you might be wondering, why are we doing a video on this now? Well, we decided to make a video on this now because so far this arrangement has worked pretty well for Putin. In maintaining friendly relations with the two most populous countries in the world, Putin has to play a delicate balancing act, but so far he's done pretty well. China and India have lent credibility to Putin's narrative that NATO are really to blame for the war, and both countries have continued to buy Russian energy exports. However, as the war continues, this delicate balancing act, and specifically the India-Russia relationship, will come under increasing strain. India-Soviet relations deepened in the 1960s and 70s due to a shared concern about China, and Delhi has always wanted Russia to serve as a counterweight to China in Eurasia. Unfortunately for India, Russia looks like it will become increasingly dependent on China, which leaves India in an uncomfortable spot. If India decides that Russia can no longer be counted on to counterbalance China, then Delhi will essentially have two options. If it wants to counterbalance China, then India will probably have to lean away from Russia and towards the West and the US. This seems to be the direction that it's headed in. India has dropped references to legitimate security interests of all sides, and stopped framing the war as a Russia-NATO problem, while statements at the UN and in the Indian Parliament have taken on a more critical tone, with the foreign minister stating that India is strongly against the conflict. India's other option, though, is to instead commit to its relationship with Russia while simultaneously trying to improve relations with China. Now, we should say that this is an unlikely outcome, largely because Sino-Indian relations aren't in a great place at the moment, and Modi has generally leaned towards the US instead of Russia, but it's worth mentioning because it would be geopolitically interesting. The idea of a Russia-China-India triangle as a counterbalance to the US was first proposed by Russian Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov in the 90s, and while it's never really took off, India's anxieties about relying on an ever more temperamental US mean it's a possibility, albeit an unlikely one. As a final thing, India's predicament is a symptom of a more general phenomenon. As the war in Ukraine continues and possibly spirals into a wider conflict between Russia and the West, countries sitting on the fence will come under more and more pressure to choose sides, and this could lead to some interesting geopolitical shifts. So subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that allows you to get smarter every day by learning huge important topics through engaging and interactive experiences. Gone are the long, boring lectures that I sat through to get my computer science degree, instead replaced by puzzles and interactive experiences which teach you the knowledge you need to know in a way you actually want to learn. It really is all the knowledge you could need too, because Brilliant have courses from the very basics of computer science and maths right through to neural networks, quantum computing, and even quantitative finance to help you better understand financial markets. All of these courses are designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning, so you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR Global, and the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for supporting the channel.